Good morning, everyone, and happy Tuesday. So, this morning I figured we can do breadcrumbing the phases of therapy questions. In this video, I try my best to make it as easy as I can to get you to see the certain words that you pay attention to, the certain phrases that you need to look out for when it comes to answering these questions. So I will teach you with universal questions, which is more of like your basic phases of therapy questions, and then I have some theory specific ones. And I can do more of these with different theories just to show each and every one of you that these are certain words that you pay attention to. So let's get started. We're going to get started with a universal question first, and then I'll show you how to do the breadcrumbs. So let's take a look at this question. That we have a therapist begins working with a family, experiencing frequent conflict between parents and a 14-year-old son. The parents are frustrated and the son is withdrawn and sarcastic. In the first session, what is the therapist's best initial goal? This is just universal, pretty basic, pretty simple, right? And when it comes to your phases of therapy questions, pay attention to what phase of therapy you're in, and then also pay attention to some of the issues that they're presenting with them, right? So A says, identify the family's presenting problem and assign a communication task. So when I show you the breadcrumbs to this, you're going to understand why each of these answers are not the best answer and why there's only one that will match everything that is in the vignette. So go ahead and take a look at some of the responses. B says challenge, C says establish rapport, right? And D says interpret. So let's take a look at the breadcrumbs and how I breadcrumb to show you the best way to find this answer. So again, I breadcrumb a therapist begins working. I looked at first session and best initial goal. A says identify the family's presenting problem. Sounds good for a first session, right? You know, you're getting to know this family, and just like in some models like strategic therapy, you are identifying a problem, right? But then at the end it says assign a communication task. Now we're moving too far. That's something that you do in the middle phase of therapy. You just met this family, right? So you're still getting to know them. B says challenge the son's resistance. Again, you just met this family. We're not doing that. But then the end of it says to engage the family system. You want to engage the family system, right? But part of B is incorrect and part of A is incorrect, which means that the whole answer is wrong. D says interpret the son's sarcasm as a symptom of triangulation. First of all, you moving too fast. You don't assume, you don't interpret, because you don't know this family. You just met them. It's the initial session, which leaves us at C, establish rapport and align with all members of the family, right? Sounds pretty easy, right, for a universal question. Okay, so let's take a look at this one. A couple comes to therapy, reporting a lack of intimacy, frequent misunderstanding, and look at that. After 2 sessions, the therapist noticed unresolved trauma in one partner. What is the therapist's next appropriate step? So let's go ahead and take a look at some of the responses. Look at the responses. Familiarize yourself with them. See which ones stick out and see which ones don't. See which ones make sense and the ones that just don't make sense after only meeting with a couple for 2 sessions, right? So take a look at it. A says, begin couples communication training. Okay. Refer the partner. Oh, Lord, we're doing a lot after 2 sessions, right? And provide some psychoeducation or assess. So let's take a look at the breadcrumbs, right? So I breadcrumb after 2 sessions because, mind you, like I've already read the vignette. Now I'm just looking for those specifiers that's going to lead me to my best answer, right? After 2 sessions, the therapist knows unresolved trauma. What is the next? Next is like what you're absolutely going to do next with this family, with this client, with this couple. Not something that you're doing down the line, right? A says begin. Okay, we can begin something, but what could we begin after 2 sessions, right? But then the rest of it says couples communication training. We moving too far. That's the middle phase. Again, that is something that's active. That's middle phase that you would do. B says refer the partner with trauma to an individual therapist. Stay away from answer responses that has you breaking up the system and moving to something individual unless you have enough information that is justified for you to do so. D says provide education about trauma responses. You moving too fast. You don't even know, about this client's trauma just yet. Assess it first. Assess how the trauma may be influencing the couple's interaction patterns. Assess first. See what the trauma is. See how it's influencing before you try to start providing psychoeducation. You don't even know what the client's trauma's responses are. And then plus providing psychoeducation, again, that is something that's active. That's something that you would do in the middle phase of therapy, right? Alrighty, next one. A family has been in therapy for several months. Huge specifier, several months. Again, this is just universal, not theory specific just yet. Working on reducing conflict between siblings. They have successfully implemented conflict resolution strategies. The therapist wants to support long-term change, but what is the most appropriate intervention at this point? So let's take a look at some of the answer responses. Go ahead and look at it. See what sticks out to you. See what makes sense. See what doesn't make sense. That after 7 months you have been in therapy with this family, what should you be doing after 7 months? And plus, it says they've been successfully implementing conflict resolution strategies. So we've got some gains, right? So we got some words like reassess, assign, we're going ahead and terminate, and we also have explore. So take a look. Make it make sense. Look at those answer responses. Several months, and they've implemented conflict resolution strategies. So, all right, let's go. I've highlighted a family, several months, successfully implemented conflict resolution strategies, and the appropriate intervention, right? So A says reassess family roles to look for unresolved enmeshment. So if I'm reassessing something, doesn't that mean I'm starting over again? Why am I starting over again when I've been in therapy with you for several months and I've successfully implemented conflict resolution strategies, right? C says terminate therapy and provide community resources. So the question said the appropriate intervention, right? They have successfully, but the therapist wants to support long-term change. How is just, terminating therapy and giving them community resources going to help them, have long-term change? Doesn't make sense, right? D says explore the parents' unresolved childhood conflicts. So when we explore childhood conflicts, seems like something that the intergenerational models will do, but that's not done after 7 months. That's done at the early phases of therapy, making D incorrect. So A says assign a task to practice new skills in a high-stress context. Now, they've been in there for several months, right? But the therapist wants to support long-term change. They've been there working on reducing conflict. So how about we assign a task to practice the new skills that they've learned since they've been there 7 months? I would hope they learned a new skill on how to work on reducing conflict between the siblings. Practicing it so that long-term they know how to still use those skills. Makes sense? Okay, let's watch this one. Another universal one. A couple is nearing the end of therapy, all right? End of therapy after resolving their main concerns. They express satisfaction, but also mild anxiety about ending treatment. What is the most appropriate therapist response? Okay, take a look at the responses and everything. And here's a question that I want everyone to understand. That when a couple, a family, a client, or whatever, they're on their way out the door because they've terminated, they've done everything they want to do. But then something else is brought up during that termination. What do you do at those moments? Do you just continue towards termination? Do you just postpone termination? What do you do, right? What is the most appropriate therapist response? Go ahead and take a look at the responses, okay? They express satisfaction, but they got some mild anxiety about ending treatment. They got some mild anxiety about separating from their therapist, right? So let's go ahead. Let's take a look at the breadcrumbs, okay? So end of therapy. They've resolved their main concerns, but they got some mild anxiety. How should the therapist respond? So remember, the therapist response is when they ask that, you're responding to what's going on in the vignette, literally what's going on in the vignette, right? A says schedule a booster session in 6 months. Okay, well, that's far down the line, and we want to answer right now, right? We want a response right now to maintain gains. Yes, you want them to maintain gains, but part of it is incorrect, making the entire answer wrong. B says encourage the couple to continue therapy to fully address any future problems. No. If the client, the couple, the family has reached their goals, they've have satisfaction, but just mild anxiety, you cannot continue to have them in therapy. There's no reason to. They've reached their goals. D says, suggest transition to individual therapy to continue progress. Again, we want to avoid answers that has us referring out to an individual therapy for somebody or splitting up the family system unless we have enough justified information to do so. C says, validate their concerns. You see their concerns. You understand their concerns. I get your concerns. And review the skills that they have learned. So now we're just going to review skills. And also at the same time, we can talk about that anxiety, right? We're not postponing termination indefinitely, right? Because they've made their goals. They've met their goals. It's time for them to go, right? Okay, let's hop into some theory-specific ones, okay? A client in individual therapy is working to differentiate from her emotionally reactive family. She reports progress but recently re-engaged in a long-standing conflict with her sister. She expresses guilt and says, I'm afraid of becoming cold like my mother. So what is a therapist's best next step? So here it is. If we go back and look at this vignette, we know what theory this is, right? And they don't even have to say it. But it's theory specific because you're looking at that term differentiate and emotionally reactive, which leads us to who? Bowen. So now we got to start thinking like a Bowen therapist and what those phases of therapy look like for Bowen, right? And those interventions for Bowen, right? What is the therapist's best next step? So the next step is literally what we're doing next, not jumping the gun, not going back in the phases of therapy, right? We're thinking Bowenians. We're Bowenians right now with this question, right? So let's take a look at some of the responses. Encourage the client temporarily distance themselves, okay? Help the client construct the genogram, okay? Guide the client, okay? And explore the symbolic meaning, okay? So let's take a look at the breadcrumbs that I did. Now, I've highlighted individual therapy, differentiate, emotionally reactive, progress that she's made, but now she's re-engaging in long-term conflict. So what is the next best step? So A says, encourage the client to temporarily distance herself from the family to reduce anxiety. Now, if we're thinking like a Bowenian, if we're thinking like Bowen, Bowen does not do what? He does not believe in emotional cutoffs. So why would he tell you to distance yourself? He doesn't honor emotional cutoffs. He honors repairing them. We're thinking like Bowen. B says, help the client construct a multi-generational genogram for deeper insight. Let's take a look at this. When do you do a genogram in Bowen therapy? That's done in the genogram phase, and it's typically done earlier on. If we go back and look at the vignette, it seems like she's phasing out of that middle phase and she's going into termination because she's now doing what? She's working on differentiating herself, right? D says, explore the symbolic meaning. That's not Bowen. That's not Bowen. So we wouldn't choose that one. Seems more like one of our humanistic approaches or something like that, right? So C says, guide the client in rehearsing a calm, self-defined position for future family interactions. So now we're talking about how it would look like when she's ready to terminate and what she's going to use, because Bowen is going to do what? Send you back home to help you work on differentiation, right? Think like Bowen. When you see it, it's theory specific, and if it's structural, strategic, or Bowen, think like those therapists. Get those thinking hats on and start thinking, what would this therapist do? Alrighty, let's go. A client has reached the end of narrative therapy. Okay, now we're thinking like a narrative therapist. We've turned off Bowen, and now we're thinking like a narrative therapist. It reports greater confidence, improved self-talk, and the ability to recognize the problem story. So now she recognizes her problem story, and her version of her identity and what is her preferred narrative, what she wants to be like, right? What is the most appropriate action at this phase? So if we take a look at this question, sounds like we're closer to the end of therapy, right? Because she's reached the end of narrative therapy. Confidence, improved self-talk. So now we're thinking like a narrative therapist, and what would a narrative therapist do in the end phase of therapy? Take a look at some of the responses. Make it make sense. Look for those responses that has you going back in the phases. If it has you going all the way back to the beginning of a phase of therapy, you know it's incorrect. If it has you doing something that's in the middle phase of therapy, such as an intervention or something that's active, you know it's incorrect. If the vignette is telling you you have reached the end phase of therapy. Make it make sense. Let's look at these breadcrumbs. Okay, so I have a client, end of narrative therapy, greater confidence, improved self-talk, and she recognizes her problem story. What is the action at this phase that we're doing? B says encourage the client to journal about future saturated episodes. Okay, so why are we encouraging her to do that when she's already recognized her problem story and she's reached her preferred narrative? Right? If we're telling somebody to journal, like, come on now. Like, no, we're going back. We're setting our back, right? C says discuss internalized beliefs that continue to reflect the dominant discourse. Why? I didn't say she had any of that. She's nearing the end. She's made progress. Why are we still? We're taking her back. We're taking her back, and there's no need to. Explore any unresolved trauma. Oh, for the love of God. If we're exploring unresolved trauma, that's something that you should have did way at the beginning, way back earlier on. Not right now when the client is ready to head out of your office because they've met their goals. It says collaborate on creating a therapeutic letter. Now, and if you're thinking like a narrative therapist, that's what a narrative therapist does at the end phase. They have you create a letter. And sometimes a narrative therapist will also write letters to their clients. Right? That's the end phase of narrative therapy. Don't go back in the phases. Stay right where you are. Do not go backwards. Do not move too fast forward. Stay where you are based on what the vignette is telling you. Okay? Oh boy, this is a long one. So we got a strategic therapy approach. Seeing a couple in their fourth session, keep that in mind. The wife strictly monitors spending and becomes anxious when she perceives a loss of financial control. The husband in turn hides the purchases and downplays the expenses. Despite recognizing the dynamic, the couple reports that nothing has changed and conflict is escalated. The therapist hypothesizes that their interaction is maintained by complementary roles of overfunctioning and covert rebellion. While escalated under pressure, both partners are open to interventions but has remained entrenched about it. What is the most strategically consistent next step? So again, take a look up there and see, just get a scheme of what's going on. Fourth session. Wife wants control of the finances. Husband doesn't want to give it to her. He's hiding the purchase, spending money, and the conflict is escalated. There's not change being made, and you're already in your fourth session. So again, turn off Bowen, turn off narrative, and turn on strategic. Now we're thinking like a strategic therapist. This is a very specific question. You are in your fourth session. What should we be doing in our fourth session with a strategic therapist? Because you know that in the first session of strategic therapist, you are doing 4 different stages, right? Social interaction, problem, and goal setting. So if we're in the fourth session, that means we already know what's going on. But in the vignette, it says nothing has worked. It's not as worked as good as it is. So let's take a look at some of my breadcrumbs, okay? Strategic, couple, fourth session. The couple reports that nothing has changed and conflict is escalated. Both partners are open to interventions. The strategic, consistent next step. Next step is what we're literally doing after. We're not waiting. We're not going back in time. We're not moving too far in time. Strategic, consistently next step. B says reframe the wife's financial control as a protective function and the husband's secrecy as an attempt to preserve peace. So now, yes, strategic. I think any model can use like a reframe, right? But we're well past a reframe with them, right? So again, we're not going back in time. If we're in the fourth session, we're probably working on what? Active interventions with this client. So we're thinking like a strategic therapist and what interventions comes with, that, right? So C says instruct the couple. Okay, we got some green because typically when it comes to a strategic therapist, you do instruct, right? You tell them what to do to create a joint financial logbook. But the rest of that answer is wrong because that sounds like cognitive behavioral therapy. So it would be incorrect. D says tell the couple. Ooh, We got some more terms that a strategic therapist will do. Tell the couple, instruct the couple, ask the couple, direct the couple, whatever the case may be. But the rest of it is incorrect. To intentionally recreate something, to recreate a conversation or something, you know what that is, right? That's structural therapy, and that's an enactment. We are thinking strategically. So let's go back to A. Instruct the husband to disclose one secret purchase per day in front of his wife. There it is. There's that directive we were looking for strategic therapy, the consistent next step, what you would do. The rest of the other three are from other models, so you automatically know they are wrong. Be able to recognize which models go with what, especially when you have those theory-specific questions, okay? After 12 sessions, a family has reestablished clear parental hierarchy, reduced sibling conflict, and increased communication. The therapist is preparing for termination. What is the most appropriate intervention at this phase? So the therapist is preparing for termination, correct? So automatically you know that we're in the termination phase, right? So take a look at some of those responses. Ask the family to identify signs, prescribe a periodontal directive, review the therapist's genogram, provide psychoeducation. Alrighty, so let's look at some of these breadcrumbs that I have. 12 sessions, reestablish clear parental hierarchy. It seems like their goals have been met. And what is an appropriate intervention in phase of therapy? Because first of all, we know that this is structural therapy, right? So we turn on our structural therapy thinking, right? So that we can find the best answer. B says prescribe a paradoxical directive. You know that's strategic, so that answer is automatically going to be out. C says review the therapist's genogram. You know that's your intergenerational models. And furthermore, a genogram is done when? In the earlier phases of therapy. This question is asking you for a termination, right? What are you going to do when it's time to terminate? C is Bowen, earlier phase. D says provide psychoeducation about attachment and internal worker models, right? So psychoeducation is typically used in, you can use them in all models, but I think it's really big in cognitive behavioral therapy. But then again, that's something you would do in the middle phase because now you have them actively doing something, right? Ask the family to identify signs of regression and rehearse responses, right? They don't want to regress, right? They're preparing them for termination. So then we're going to do what? We're going to help them consolidate their gains so that after therapy, they still are going to have those tools with them so that they can use them, right? Okay, a family presents with a 16-year-old son recently suspended for school for aggressive behavior. The parents disagree on discipline. The mother is permissive, while the father is an authoritative. In the third session, the therapist directs the mother and father to speak directly to one another, while the son is instructed to observe silently. Okay, here we are. What intervention and phase is this therapist most utilizing? You know that this is structural therapy, right? Even when you take a look at the responses, we know that it's structural therapy. We just need to figure out which phase and which intervention are they using, right? So let's take a look at it, right? Let's look at it again. We're in the third session. The third session. So we're structural therapists now, and we're thinking about what you are doing in a third session. A says joining, B says unbalancing, C says reframing, and assigning enactments. Let's take a look at some of these breadcrumbs that I have. Okay, so I have a family. Third session, directs the mother and father to speak directly to one another while the son is instructed to observe silently. What intervention and phase is the therapist most likely utilizing? A says joining in the early phase. No, we're in the third session already, so joining is out, and plus they have them doing some role playing or whatever it is that they're doing, so that's definitely not going to be something that's happening in the early phase, right? C says reframing in the termination phase to promote insight. Nope, nothing about termination is going on because they're still working on what? Trying to reposition the hierarchies. D says assigning enactments. Nice, right? Because we think that because the mother and the father are directly speaking to each other while the son observes, right? But no, that's not an enactment, because an enactment would be what the entire family would be reenacting what happened at home, right? Does that make sense? The therapist or the mother father speak directly to one another, while the son is instructed to observe silently. That is unbalancing, right? The middle phase to restructure the parental hierarchy. If we go back and look, the parents disagree on discipline. So now we have to get the mother and the father together as a unified front. And that's the way to do it. Unbalancing, middle phase, because unbalancing is what? An intervention that you would be doing in a third session, which is the middle phase of therapy for structural therapy. I hope this made sense for everyone. I hope that you are able to take a look at some of these questions, learn and understand how you identify middle phase, beginning phase, early phase, late phase, termination phase when it comes to these questions. Again, if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, please drop me a comment, find me on Facebook, send me a message, let me know. I hope everyone have a great Tuesday, and I will talk to you all soon.